Okay, so this is the officer's manual that I've been going over, and this is part 3, civil jurisdiction on a military reservation. We have the first paragraph here. First, it talks about has exclusive jurisdiction. The second one, it says not exclusive jurisdiction. So in this first sentence, it's talking about where the federal government purchases lands inside the state for the erection of forts, which is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution. The state has to not only sell the lands, but they also have to give up the rights to make laws for the lands. But some states do not give up the the right to make laws for those federal lands. Some states keep the right to make laws for those federal lands, in which case then the federal government has to abide by the state laws on the federal lands. And then in some cases where the states do not keep any jurisdiction, and jurisdiction is power and authority on the federal lands, then the state laws don't apply to the federal people on the federal lands. Okay, so it says where the United States has exclusive jurisdiction over a reservation, the state laws do not run, and no service of civil or criminal process may be had excepting such as proceeds from the federal courts. So it says where states don't keep the rights to make law on the federal land, that they have no right to serve civil processes. Now, this is an officer's manual, so it's talking to the federal officers on the military posts so that they can know when they go to a state and they go to command a federal area, the military over the federal area, that they know whether or not the state has ceded jurisdiction in what they can or cannot do on that military post. Okay, so if the state comes and says we want to serve process here, and the state had not reserved any rights over those areas, the state has no right to come onto the land to serve the process. But some states did reserve rights over the federal lands, and so they can serve process, and that's what it's talking about here. So where the United States, and the United States is the federal government, when it says United States, it's talking about federal, has no exclusive jurisdiction, meaning power and authority, has not all right over the federal land. So the state has some right over the federal land. So the federal government does not have all rights over the federal land. And no cession of jurisdiction has been made by the state. So the state did not keep any power for itself over those federal lands, or where the state did keep some power for itself over the federal lands, then the laws of the state apply on the federal lands. This whole idea of the federal government having power and authority over private people comes from their instrumentalities. It's all a lie. It's not in the Constitution. And they get you by getting you to sign these contracts. And these contracts are on forms approved by the federal government. But when you go and you look up the form approval process, it says there during the approval process whether or not the federal form is constitutional or non-constitutional. And most of them are not. If it requires you to sign it, then it's not constitutional. If you're not a federal person and they're asking you to sign it, then it's just a contract. It's just a federal contract. A contract with, not even a federal contract, a contract with its instrumentalities. So people are confused about whether or not the IRS is a federal entity. It is and it is not. It depends on who they're contracting with. If you're working for the federal government, you're a military person or a civil servant or what have you, then yes, you're supposed to pay federal taxes. If you're not one of those federal people, then they get you to sign a form that doesn't comply with the ideas of the Constitution, which is federalism. And it requires your signature as a private person, and then it's a private contract. And that's why when some of these people go into courts and they start saying that it's unconstitutional, the court doesn't care, because you're not there under the Constitution, you're there under a private contract made through an instrumentality which has no power or authority and no constitutional power. It has nothing except your signature and agreement to do a thing. But once you agree to do a thing, then they've got you. It's a contract. And once you sign the contract agreeing to do a thing, you can't turn around and say, well, I disagree now. The contract has to be properly ended. So when you go into court and you're arguing over a private contract and you're bringing up the Constitution, it doesn't matter because the judge is not sitting in a constitutional office. He's sitting outside of one. Even if he has an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, they claim that the right to make contracts is in the Constitution, but then they turn around and claim that they can't interfere with contracts. And that's in the Constitution also. So they claim to have both ways. Either way, they win. And that's, of course, an impossibility. The laws of such state run on the reservation as they do in all other parts of the state. So what they're saying is some states reserve the right to make laws on the federal lands, some states don't. That's basically all this says. Some states gave up all right over the federal land and don't want anything to do with it, which means that the federal government then has all power over the federal lands, all right to make laws, and that the state does not have the right to come onto the federal lands for any purposes. Here, where it says the federal government does not have all power over the federal land because the state did not give it all up, that the state does have the right to serve process unless it interferes directly with the military functions. Because the military is an instrumentality of the federal government. Okay, so where the right to serve process has been reserved by a state, such process can only be the result of acts committed outside of the reservation. The reservation, okay? What does this word mean? It means many different things, but really it all boils down to one thing. A reservation is a federal land. And the federal lands constitutionally only are for the federal military posts. They call these a lot of different things: areas, enclaves, islands, posts, bases, installations, military reservations, federal lands, okay? All different kinds of things. In the Constitution, it's called the lands, okay? Or places purchased. And obedience will be given by all persons on the reservation to such process. So it's telling the commanding officer what he needs to know in direction of how to run the lands in the state where he is commanding officer over that military post. So every commanding officer has to understand what state he's in and what power the state has over that military post, if any. Because some states were like, yeah, you can have all power. We don't care. Just do your thing, whatever. Some other states were like, you can have a little bit of power, and I'm going to keep a little bit of power. And then other states were like, you get no power except for the military stuff you're doing, and that's it. And we reserve the right to do anything we want on the federal lands, providing it's a law created by us. So it says, where it amounts to an arrest of a military person, the commanding officer, there's a commanding officer on each military post, okay? Just like there's a commanding officer at the seat of government, and that's called the president. Every commanding officer has a military home on the post because every post has to be occupied. It has to be watched over. That's what the commanding officer is supposed to do. If the commanding officer has to leave the military post, his executive officer, and at the seat of government, that would be the vice president, has to be there. Someone has to be there. Otherwise, the post is considered abandoned. If the president leaves Washington, D.C. and doesn't leave someone in charge and there's not someone there, then the post is abandoned. That's why the president has a house at the seat of government, because someone always has to be there because it's a military post. The seat of government is a military post. It's watched over by the military. Every single military post has a commanding officer who has a home, who has to be there. And if he's not there, his executive officer's there. If he's not there, then someone else has to be appointed and be there. Otherwise, the post is abandoned. Military posts cannot be abandoned. So the commanding officer will permit him to be removed by the civil powers unless at the time he be awaiting trial by a military court or serving a sentence of the same. In this case, the commanding officer will inform the civil authorities, the state, of this fact and decline to surrender the prisoner because he's already in prison or he's getting ready to go to prison because he's in court. So it's saying here that a military person has to serve their military time first, and then later they'll give them to the state. The civil authorities, so the state, should receive notice, so some kind of letter, statement saying why they're not turning them over. However, of the expiration of the term of confinement of the soldier in order that they may take such measures after his release to vindicate the law as they see fit. So if a military person is just going around committing crimes on post, off post, wherever, he has to serve his military time first, and then the military will send a letter to the state or the civil authorities, which is the state authorities, saying at this point in time we're going to release him, and we can release him to your custody so that you can take him, and then you can put him in through your court, and then he can serve his time with the state for whatever crime he or she committed in the state. Where the process takes the form of a writ of subpoena or of a summons to appear before a court, a commander should assist the court by granting permission, if need be, to an officer or soldier to absent himself from the command in order to comply with the process, or in the case of a prisoner who is needed as a witness, by sending him when he is wanted under proper guard. So I want to touch just real quick on something I was talking about before, where the military post has to be occupied at all times. So the whole purpose to have the military restricted to the federal lands as if it was an island, and some federal writings do call them islands. They call them islands because they're not supposed to come off the federal lands. It's as if they're surrounded by water. They're not supposed to come off the federal lands. They're supposed to stay there. They go onto the federal lands. They serve their time, 4, 6, 8 years, whatever, unless they re-enlist, and then it's longer. And then they stay there. They don't come off. They originally were not supposed to come off the federal lands. That was some of the big problems we had with the military people during the early days, because the military people wanted to come off the federal lands and bring their kids to the state schools to go to school. And the states were saying, well, you don't pay taxes here, so why are you coming off the federal lands and trying to bring your kids here? And they even sued in a state court, and they lost because they're not inhabitants of the state. You see that in the Constitution, where it says if these military people want to serve at the seat of government, they have to be so many years a citizen of the United States, meaning so many years in the military, serving in the state, but not an inhabitant of the state. They can't live in the state. They can't be in the state, in the independent state. They can only be on the federal lands, which they call a dependent state, but they don't call it directly a dependent state. The only thing the Constitution has power over is the dependent state, which is the military areas inside the state. So they're not even supposed to come off because they became citizens of almost like a whole nother country. So some people say the United States is a country. Yes, but the United States and the states together are not a country. They're a nation. Okay, so there is no method laid down for the service of process on an officer or a soldier where such process is to be obeyed. The manner of service cannot, from a military point of view, be questioned, but much trouble may be avoided if the process server is familiar enough with military requirements to apply in the first place to the commanding officer for guidance and assistance. A civilian may legally be arrested without a warrant as well as by a military person, as by any civilian where he commits a felony or a crime in breach of the public peace in such person's presence, or where, a felony having been committed, such person has probable cause for believing that the party arrested is a felon. Anyone can arrest anyone. That's ancient law. If you see somebody doing something, you can arrest them. It's called a citizen's arrest. In a case of such an arrest at a military post, the arresting officer or soldier should use no unnecessary violence, should disclose his official character and inform the party of the cause of his arrest, and should deliver him as soon as reasonably practicable to a civil officer authorized to hold and bring him before a court or magistrate for disposition. Where the crime is committed on a reservation by a civilian, he should at once be arrested and turned over with a statement of the case to the nearest civil authority for trial by the federal courts. He may be held in the guardhouse for only such intervals as may be absolutely necessary. Where a soldier commits murder, a crime not punishable by court-martial in time of peace, where a soldier commits murder, a crime not punishable by court-martial in time of peace on a military reservation, he may be confined to the guardhouse until or after communication with the nearest United States attorney, he shall be turned over to the civil authorities. They didn't put a period here. I don't know if it's just missing. Process in civil suits ensuing from the federal courts and from state courts where such service is permissible must be accepted and obeyed by the military on a military reservation, as it would be elsewhere. Any defense there should be submitted to civil courts, or should be, I don't know what that means. Courts, it's probably a typo. Okay, so next time we'll go over habeas corpus, and it has to do with being arrested, I think, by the military, and that's the only time habeas corpus comes into play, because habeas corpus shall not be suspended, right? So that's in the Constitution. So when people bring up the federal Constitution and a habeas corpus in a civilian court, they're getting mixed up between what their rights are and what their rights are not. Okay, let's see. There was something else I wanted to mention. Slipped my mind. Okay, so this is all about the federal Constitution having limited power and authority, which extends only to the federal lands. And sometimes the federal power is under the state power when on a federal land the state has reserved jurisdiction, which is power and authority, over those federal lands. That right there tells you all the states have sovereignty over the federal government when not on federal lands, and some states reserved their sovereignty even on the federal lands, which tells you one thing: all the states are sovereign over the federal government, and the only time they're not is when certain states did not retain power, but then that extends only over the federal lands. So the federal government in some situations have ultimate power and authority on the federal lands. In some cases they don't, but they have no authority or power off the federal lands. Okay? The states retain sovereignty over their own lands and their original state jurisdictions. Okay, so the states are supposed to keep the federal government in line. They're not supposed to allow the federal government to come onto its lands and do whatever it wants, even if it calls itself the state of Texas, state of Virginia, etc., and so forth. In the early congressional records, when states were joining the Union, it looked like this. The comments looked like this. Virginia, meaning the state or the Commonwealth of Virginia, ceded some lands to the United States for the erection of the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia is just saying that there are federal lands now in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia agreed to join the Union and have the federal government build forts and run the military on those federal lands. The instrumentalities or the businesses that the federal government has created to do work off the federal lands are highly illegal, not permitted by the Constitution, even though they do all kind of bendy, switchy, changey bullshit to get us to think it does. It doesn't. Because the federal government only has power and authority on the federal lands. And those are all, or should be all, in the state cession laws. Each state has cession laws showing what power it gave to the federal government, but only on the federal lands. Okay, so even its instrumentalities don't have federal authority off the federal lands. They only have the authority of a private corporation off the federal lands. That's why they require you to sign its contracts. So, yes, the IRS has a federal side, meaning it has a right to take some money from the federal people, from their pay, to pay taxes, the federal taxes. It does not have the right to, in a federal capacity, take taxes from people not on the federal lands, not receiving money from the federal government. Okay, so what they do is they get you to sign these forms, and then the federal government approves the forms, but they're not federal forms. And they say during the approval process whether or not it's a federal form and it complies with the Constitution. Many of them do not, which means the IRS has a portion of it that serves constitutionally, and it has a portion of it that serves not constitutionally, but administering private contracts. Because when you sign to pay taxes and you're not a federal person, you're just making a contract. Just like you would buy a car, you're just telling the federal government you agree to make it bigger and more powerful and support the military and all the other. It's not even really the military. They have a whole list of things like the Red Cross and all these other policies and just these different organizations that it wants to support with your money. And when you agree to sign the federal forms paying a tax, you're agreeing to send money to these different public organizations. Okay, so it's all a scam. It's all a lie. They have no power to force you to sign a piece of paper. If they did have the power to make you pay federal taxes, they wouldn't need you to sign and agree to do it. They would just do it. And this kind of helps people understand this section, Section 3, that the federal government only has power on federal lands. It's said over and over and over again. And I'm really sort of shocked that this has not, these ideas, this fact has not exploded, and that people have not seen my videos or heard about this, and they're not like majorly everywhere talking about this, even if it has nothing to do with me, just the ideas and the fact that it's stated this over and over and over again. The propaganda and the lies that they tell is just overwhelming. And as far as some of the people who claim to be libertarians and claim to just, want freedom and sovereignty and liberty and independence, why they have not been talking about this, why they are not telling people in their videos and in their speeches and what have you, that the government has no power, and here's the proof that it doesn't. Why aren't they talking about this? I don't know. I can't figure it out. It's just it shocks me, really. I've given all the proof. I've given the congressional reports. I've given the Eisenhower report. I've given the GSA reports, state laws, session laws, the constitutions, the jurisprudence information, and I'm just shocked, really, that people are having such a hard time accepting this, and maybe they just don't understand it. I don't know, but it's hard for me to get this information out myself, because if I go onto YouTube and I go to other people's channels and I say, hey, I explain all of this, what this guy's trying to say in detail, or how he's wrong, but it's on my channel, then YouTube just deletes my post. So it's hard for me to bring people into my channel. Facebook has kicked me off Facebook. I'm kicked off Twitter. I can't really post things on, Telegram. And I've been on a couple of these other social media platforms, but if I post something more than once, then my posts get deleted, and then I get told that I can't post anything for, 30 minutes or some shit. So it's really hard for me to get the information out, so I kind of depend on other people to help me out and bring people to my channel and help them understand this. And if you make a comment in the comment section, then I'll see your comment. Mostly I see the comments. Sometimes comments show up, and then it was posted a month ago, and I'm like, oh, where did this come from? I never even got notification that there was a comment. So every once in a while I just go through and I look at the comments section where I can see where people have commented on my videos, because if I wait for the notices, then sometimes they just never come. So I'm not ignoring anyone, but if you post questions, I'll try my best to answer your questions. I'll be doing a few more videos, maybe today, maybe not today. I have a lot of stuff to do, but please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please go out and talk about this stuff to your family, to your friends, to your neighbors, to your children, to your children's friends, if they're, old enough to understand, to strangers, to anybody who will listen, basically. You can lead them to my channel, or just lead them to the information, say, hey, read this book. I try to post all this stuff on my archive webpage. So I have Jen the Liberty Lion on archive.org, where I post most of these books and papers and maps and a whole bunch of other stuff. And if you want to look through there, you can find it. This book is probably on there. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, so like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.